Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. With the contracts of key players up for renewal in the not too distant future and a big summer window on the horizon, Arsenal's new sporting director, Andrea Berta, has plenty to do. So where do Arsenal's priorities lie this summer? And could Viktor Gyokeres be the answer to their number 9 dilemma? All right, with us today, we've got the Athletic's David Ornstein and also James McNicholas as well. James, fresh out of the international break, Arsenal win 2-1 over Fulham. Mikel Arteta described Bukayo Saka's return as a beautiful moment. Talk to us about the feeling, the sound in the stadium when Saka came back from injury and scored the winner.
It was quite incredible, actually. My colleague Art Roche nudged me and said, I think Saka's coming on. You know, he was sort of trotting back towards the bench and the crowd rose, like the whole stadium was standing before the board even went up because they knew what was coming. Ethan Ranieri comes off, on comes Saka. It's a huge, huge roar of welcome, appreciation, gratitude that they've got their star man back. And then 7 minutes later, an even bigger one when he stoops to head the ball into the back of the net. A fairy tale return, runs over to the Arsenal bench, celebrating with the fitness coach, Sam Wilson, and, you know, the staff who've really helped him recuperate, rehabilitate and be ready to play after this international break. Wonderful moment for him and Arsenal, and a timely lift, really, because we're 7 days out from the Real Madrid tie in the Champions League, which, you know, is a defining moment, really, for Arsenal's season. Everything kind of hangs on that. And to have their talisman back potentially ahead of that game is a huge boost.
Yeah, David, you can't help but think, you know, even the game against Fulham, Saka comes on, scores a goal, a shining moment, and then Arsenal technically lose 2 defenders. You know, almost a tale of Arsenal's season in many respects.
You took the words out of my mouth. It encapsulates the last 9 months, really, doesn't it? And it's not been a vintage season so far for Arsenal, and it's been undermined by losing key players. However, it could still have a strong ending. And by the way, when I say not vintage, you know, that's because they would have expected to pose a bigger challenge to Liverpool so far for the title, or whoever else had been up there, a bigger challenge for the domestic cup competitions. But they've done fantastically well in the Champions League, and let's see what the next chapter of that brings. And they are competitive. You know, this is something that was not the case in the early days of Mikel Arteta's reign, in the Unai Emery era, and towards the end of Arsene Wenger's tenure. And so we've got to remember that and keep the perspective and the context. But with the progress, which is undeniable, expectations have shifted. And that's brought a bit of disappointment so far. But, you know, Arsenal getting this far in the Champions League and they are capable of beating Real Madrid. I don't think that's impossible, even though Real Madrid will understandably go in as favourites. And to retain their Champions League berth is vitally important for the club and for a summer that we know is going to be hugely important in the transfer market, because there is now this sort of growing external pressure, whether or not it translates internally, let's see, on Mikel Arteta and the squad and the club to deliver silverware next season. But, you know, the injuries have at times been crippling for them. Martin Odegaard missed 3 months earlier on. Then it was Saka. Now it's potentially Gabriel, maybe even Timber. We don't know the prognosis of those at the time of recording. I do remember a few years ago when Gabriel went down, as Arsenal lost, I think, to Tottenham away towards the end of the season. He limped off and everybody thought that's Arsenal's season done. Gabriel, one of their defensive rocks, is out, and he started the next game at Newcastle. Now, I'm not suggesting that will happen on this occasion.
Don't do that, David. Don't do that. Don't give us hope.
I'm absolutely not suggesting that will happen on this occasion. Certainly not at Everton on Saturday lunchtime. However, we just need to wait to see what actually happens here.
Okay. Well, James, we're going to be talking number 9 shortly. I mentioned Gyokeres at the top, but have a little word for Mikel Merino. 7 goals this season, 2 assists, but 5 goals in 8 games up front. Mikel Arteta has a knack of tweaking his team, and he's up front out of necessity, but it's not a bad return, is it?
No, not at all. I think he's got 4 out of the last 5 Arsenal goals in the Premier League. He's having the best goal-scoring league campaign of his career at this point in time. He's done tremendously well. And there was a lot of criticism of Arsenal's decision to go through January without signing a striker. And I think a lot of that was understandable and perhaps even justifiable. But you have to say the way that they've dealt with the fallout to that, the tactical innovation that Mikel Arteta has shown by playing Merino there, first bringing him on as a substitute against Leicester to score twice and then starting with him since. And the way in which the player himself has taken on this challenge, adapted to it, learned the position, they're both very, very deserving of praise for that. He's doing really well. I mean, it sounds crazy to say, but when you look at the raw numbers and you look at that Madrid versus Arsenal tie, he actually comes into it as one of the form attackers from the 2 squads, which I don't think anyone would have imagined a few months ago. Look, he's not a perfect solution, and it's important to remember this is a midfielder playing up front. There are things that Arsenal miss. I think without Kai Havertz there, certainly his movement, his ability to drift into wide areas, his willingness to run in behind, which I think is an underrated aspect of Havertz's play. Arsenal absolutely adore Havertz because he enacts Mikel Arteta's instructions to the letter so efficiently with so much energy and physicality. I don't think Merino is used to that, and so inevitably there is a bit of a drop-off. But you couldn't really ask for much more from him. I mean, frankly, if Arsenal had bought a forward in January and he produced this sort of goal-scoring return, I think we'd all be saying it was going rather well. So massive credit to him. And he scored in the international break for Spain as well. So it is certainly a rich vein of form.
All right, let's move on because we need to talk about Andrea Berta, James, after Arsenal's new sporting director was officially confirmed on Sunday. James, a due lift in November. Firstly, tell us how the club search led them to Berta, because we've spoken about a few names that were involved, but also, how involved was Mikel Arteta in this process?
Well, when Edu left, Arsenal had to act quickly to fill the berth, and Edu had his deputy, Jason Ato, who was the assistant sporting director, and he stepped up as interim. And at the same time, Arsenal instigated a recruitment process to find a permanent successor for Edu. Now, Ato was a candidate within that. The process started with the use of an external recruitment agency who sifted through candidates, identified potential people for Arsenal to speak to, and that was gradually worked down to a smaller shortlist who progressed to an interview stage. I think I'd say around January, when it became very clear that Berta was available, when it was announced he was leaving Atletico Madrid, his candidacy grew and grew over the months that followed, and he emerged as a really strong contender for the position. Ultimately, after meeting with the key executives at the club, the key decision makers, the hierarchy, including Mikel Arteta, because the relationship between the sporting director and the manager is going to be so critical to Arsenal's success moving forward, it was decided that Berta was the guy to go for. He's got a wealth of experience from Atletico Madrid. This is a guy with international profile, good relationships across Europe, and who ultimately I think Arsenal feel can help them get the deals done that they need to go to that final stage of the project, to go from repeating challengers, people who are consistently there or thereabouts, to becoming serial winners, which is what everyone at Arsenal wants, and Mikel Arteta above all else. Clearly he believes, and the club believe, that Andrea Berta can help them achieve that.
Yeah, David, is that the one? We talk about sporting directors a lot on the podcast. I'm just thinking about what made him stand out. James has listed a lot of pluses there, but also I'm just thinking someone who's constantly played with a team in the Champions League, someone who's constantly dealt with a manager that's highly demanding. Are these some of the things that really work for Arsenal?
Yeah, definitely. They had a very competent incumbent in position in Jason Ato, who knows the club inside out now. He started there as a scout. He has worked alongside Edu. He's risen up through the system, and he's familiar with everybody on the football side and the more administrative side and the executive side. And he was a strong contender for the role. Berta ticks a lot of the boxes in their eyes because he has operated in this role at the elite level of European football, which Jason Ato hasn't, because he's not been in the number one role on a permanent basis. And it looks like that will come to him in time, whether it be at Arsenal or elsewhere. And Berta has that advantage. If you look at the available options that were on the market and those that Arsenal either spoke to, interviewed, or considered and discussed and pondered internally, you had names such as Dan Ashworth, who of course came out of Manchester United, has been a very well-known sporting director. But is he the type of individual who Arsenal were looking for, and is this the type of role that he wanted to take on? It emerges off the back of the Newcastle and Manchester United experiences that he was less this recruitment guru that he was being painted to be in some quarters, and more maybe sort of a really good club builder, logistics and department structurer, if that's even a word. You then have people like Roberto Alabe at Real Sociedad. He's done a fine job there, but he's not considering his next steps until the final day that he spends at Real Sociedad, which is in the middle of the summer. That would not have been ideal for Arsenal, and so that one sort of seemed to have flitted away. Thiago Scuro at Monaco has done a really good job, and I think the likelihood has always been that he will extend his time there. He's relatively new in the job. And, other names that James mentioned in reporting, like Thomas Rositzky's done a really good job. He's well known at Arsenal. But if you look at all of those options, there would have been some more, others who are of the correct ilk, but they're in jobs and they're unattainable. I'm sure there are people Arsenal would have spoken to or looked at that we don't know the names of. They were just among a long list that was brought to them with the help of a recruitment firm. They then whittled it down to a short list that was sort of taken on to interview stage. And Berta, as you point out, has worked with somebody of the ilk of Diego Simeone and the success and progress that they've brought at Atletico Madrid, but also his personality, his combustibility, his emotion, managing that dovetailing. It probably hasn't always been smooth, but that is direct experience of a managerial mould that Arsenal have, to be honest, in Mikel Arteta, someone that's very powerful, very influential, very vocal, has done a fantastic job, and somebody that can challenge that person and can communicate with them and collaborate with them. And they felt Berta ticked that box. Berta has a very strong network of relationships around Europe and the world with agents, with club directors, sporting directors. He's worked outside of football, so that's where he actually began. He then comes into football at a lower level, moves higher in Italy, transitions over to Spain. Most people that you speak to who are involved in deal making in European football, they've dealt with Andrea Berta. Most people regard him quite highly. Some don't know him so well. Some are a bit quizzical. These people aren't sort of professors. They're not magicians. They don't turn water into wine. They have friends, enemies, anywhere in between. That they also tend to be judged over the test of time. They're not some silver bullet that's going to come in and immediately transform and be the, wave their wand and all ills will be cured and all will be well in the world. And, the modern football and the modern football fan seems to pin all its hope on the sporting director, and they sort of immortalise them. Arsenal fans had it with sort of Raul Sanllehi, who was sort of nicknamed Don Raul for some of the deals he worked on. And then he ended up leaving soon after. And then Edu is cooking was the phrase on sort of social media. And these guys, as fans and the public scrutinise every inch of football, they've almost become the celebrities, the iconic figures. We were done with managers and coaches, and now the sporting director holds the key to our transfer dreams. And I think a bit of patience is going to be required. He's said to be a very subtle, understated, discreet guy who doesn't make many public pronouncements, which is quite interesting because Edu at the Brazilian FA before he came to Arsenal, he would pick the squad. He would announce it. He would hold press conferences. He would do interviews. He would interact with the media. It worked differently when you come to the Premier League, where everything is a little bit more under the radar. That is more Andrea Berta's way. I'm sure he'll work fastidiously, like extremely hard, to try and deliver what Arsenal want this summer, which is an immediate and crucial priority in the transfer market.
Yeah, James, you've written about Mikel Arteta's fifth phase, which basically looks at the club looking to obviously win trophies. I wonder how that does marry with Mikel Arteta's ambitions as well, someone who's come with that ilk, helping him to get to that phase, but also, I guess, in a very strange way, it's probably why Jason Ito wasn't top of that list, because he knows the game, but perhaps not the reputation.
I think so, and probably there's a sense in which Arsenal were looking for some outside perspective, something that would give them, a different take on how to move forward. And I think they welcome that external experience. That said, look, the club think very, very highly of Jason Ito, and they would like him to stay and work alongside Andrea Berta, because there's been a lot of good recruitment work done at Arsenal in recent years, and there's not necessarily a need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think they don't want to sort of dismantle the structure, the infrastructure that Edu spent so long building up. But yeah, I think certainly Mikel Arteta has spoken about this summer being critical in Arsenal's development, being incredibly important. On the eve of the Fulham game, he actually suggested that this is a summer that he had earmarked for some time. He spoke about how years in advance he looks at each summer window and what it could signify in the trajectory of the squad. And this one he has always felt would be particularly big. I think those of us outside the club would agree with that. When you look at what needs to be done, the centre-forward position needs to be augmented, strengthened. There's some very experienced players going out of contract in Jorginho and Thomas Partey. There are some other players at critical points in contract negotiations. Bukayo Saka himself, Gabriel, who else? William Saliba, all with 2 years remaining on their deal. Gabriel Martinelli, another with 2 years remaining on his deal, albeit with an optional additional year in the club's favour. So this is an incredibly important time. Arsenal have got Andrea Berta in ahead of this summer transfer window. I think that was an important part of their process. They did not want to leave this unanswered heading into the summer. And he's got a couple of months now to get his feet under the desk, get adjusted to life in England, life working with this team, with this staff, and with this football committee at Arsenal who make the key decisions. And it's going to be a fascinating period because we have this new element, this new person who will be wielding some influence on recruitment matters for Arsenal. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out.
Right, David, let's discuss Berta's priorities, starting with the summer transfers first. James and David, you've both reported that Sporting's Viktor Gyokeres has been admired by Berta for quite a while. Is it fair to say that number 9 position is the top target for the club this summer, David?
Yeah, number 9 is of course, at the top of the agenda. Everybody knows that now. It's not the only priority, which is something I'll come on to talk about in a moment, because they've long wanted a wide attacker, a winger. We know about the Nico Williams interest, and there'll be others too. There are areas that need to be addressed, such as midfield, given the departures of Partey and Jorginho likely, and the potential arrival of Zubimendi, maybe one other. Let's see if they follow up the Nipan interest from January. There'll be departures, at least one at left back, with Kieran Tierney going to Celtic, Will Zinchenko depart too. They're going to need 1 or 2 goalkeepers, with Neto returning to Bournemouth and maybe Setford going out on loan. And that's just some of the work that needs to be done. It's an extremely vital summer for Arsenal, but let's take nothing away from that centre forward role. They've been linked with many names for a long time. January saw them attempt to sign Ollie Watkins. It was an opportunity presented to them potentially by Aston Villa, depending on what decision they would make on John Duran. It didn't work out with Arsenal. John Duran departed, and let's see if that ship has sailed now. I think most probably, but you never know in this industry. Then there are the sort of priority targets, which is Alexander Isak in the eyes of Mikel Arteta, but Newcastle have no intention of selling him. Their fans hate that we're even having this conversation. The price, if there is one, would be extortionate for any suitors. He has a bit of an injury history, which clubs may bear in mind. However, there's no doubting his quality, and the admiration doesn't go away. But I think there is a realism at Arsenal, Liverpool as well, who like him too, and there'll be many other suitors. So then you do have to consider alternative options. They've done a hell of a lot of work on Benjamin Sesko, and rightly so. Many at the club would like to push forward with that potential opportunity. His footballing profile, his age profile, there are other suitors too. I think there are some reservations on whether he's quite ready for what they want to do, which James described as delivering major trophies now. And is there somebody that can come in and help with that immediate priority? And of course, Gyokeres has been mentioned in relation to Arsenal, many other clubs for quite a long time. And we published the story on Sunday evening that Arsenal are developing a strong interest in him, and that Andrea Berta has been a huge admirer of him for a long time. That dates back to his time at Atletico Madrid. And people saw that and said, oh, what are they reporting? He's always been on the radar. What's changed? I think it's pretty clear what's changed in that the sporting director who's arriving rates him extremely highly. And when you look at the price, in theory, I think people have said around 70 million euros. The salary you would imagine would fit into Arsenal's wage structure, which is another issue maybe with Alexander Isak, who's being paid very well at Newcastle and would want, understandably, a rise. And what sort of a rise would Arsenal or Liverpool give him that would take him far beyond what Newcastle would be prepared to do? Gyokeres, you would imagine, would fit in. His record at Sporting speaks for itself. People can scrutinise that in the Portuguese league. They can scrutinise Coventry. They can scrutinise his style for Arsenal's system, etc., etc. It's great that we all talk about these things. I don't know nearly as much as everybody else that's pontificating on that front, but we have sourced properly that he's going to be a really strong contender, which, to my understanding, previously was not necessarily the case. I don't think he figured as highly as it looks like he will this summer. That is not saying they're going to sign him, but clearly he's one we should be paying close attention to. And I said I'd come back to the point about the other positions. What I want to say is that, if you do in some hypothetical world go and spend the amount that is being touted for Alexander Isak, what money do you have left over to address the other positions in the team? A lot of that might depend on departures, but there are a lot of ifs and buts here. If you do a deal at the level of say, a Gyokeres, financially, that probably leaves you quite a lot more wiggle room and room to manoeuvre on upgrading in certain areas and moulding the squad that you feel can go on to challenge for those multiple major honours that everybody's talking about.
Okay, brilliant. Well, as we're talking about Gyokeres, let's hear from the Athletic's Jack Lang on whether or not the player would be a good fit for Arteta's side.
Is Gyokeres a good fit for Arsenal? Well, my crystal ball is actually in for its annual service at the moment, so you'll forgive me for hedging my bets a little bit. Obviously, history is littered with cases of strikers in Portugal, in the Netherlands, leagues of that level moving to our league and not quite being able to cut it. So I think that is an open question. In terms of style, I think yes and no. I think he has some things that I think would be very interesting to Arsenal. He's very powerful, he's very quick, something that the current options aren't necessarily. And as I wrote in the piece, there's something about him that's just very self-sufficient, is what I wrote. So he's someone who will receive a ball in a channel and instead of kind of being buffeted by a defender, he'll kind of just find a way to trample through him or go round him and seem to always get a shot off. And that, to me at least, really is a big difference with someone like Kai Havertz, who's a really good player. But I can think of quite a few times this season when he's been fed a ball into a channel and, ends up losing the ball or turning back. But in terms of structure, in terms of system, Arsenal don't get many of those opportunities to play on the counter-attack into space. So would he be an option, a feasible option in those games, a bit tighter against mass defences? I think that's certainly up for debate, perhaps not. So then you're looking at a striker who maybe you're playing in the bigger games when there's more of a even feel to the match and Arsenal may get a bit more space. Hopefully, if it happens, it'll work out well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jack. Some really interesting points he makes there, James. Look, really fascinating. Gyokeres, 85 goals in 91 appearances and across all competitions since joining Sporting in the summer of 2023. This season, 42 goals in 42 matches for Sporting and 12 in 12 for Sweden. Right, this is the thing. Top striker, but also to get those numbers, I feel selfish, focused on scoring goals. Arsenal are a team that like to share it about. It's about teamwork. If you look at Kai Havertz up front, is he the right tactical fit? I know he can score goals, but is he the right tactical fit for what Mikel Arteta wants from a striker?
It's a great question. I mean, you can't argue with the goals record, can you? It's astonishing. And if he can translate that kind of productivity to the Premier League, then he'll be the bargain of the century, frankly, at any price. In terms of what Arsenal want from their centre-forward, you mentioned Kai Havertz, and I think we can't discount him in this conversation. He really does embody so much of what Mikel Arteta wants to see from a striker. His team ethic, his tactical intelligence, his physicality, and actually a pretty decent goals record himself this season. Not quite in the Gyokeres territory, but I think about 1 in 2, which is a creditable return. So I think he does so much of what Mikel Arteta wants. But if you listen to Arteta this season, there have been several games where afterwards he's spoken about efficiency in the penalty area, efficiency in the box, efficiency of decision-making and execution of finishing. And I think if they do go down the road with Gyokeres, that will be the difference they're looking for from him, the contribution he makes. There are so many unknowns about any transfer, and I think this one in particular, there would be a lot of questions over how that adaptation would go. As impressive as that goal record is, there's plenty of penalties in there. There's plenty of goals, as Jack mentioned, that come from opportunities where he has to run into space, to run in behind. We see that so rarely with Arsenal, facing the low block as they do week in, week out. I think if he was to come to Arsenal, he might have to adapt his game to become more of a penalty box player. But I'm curious to see how it will play out. And I also think Arsenal might be looking for a player who they can see playing alongside Havertz in a way, maybe not as a front two conventionally, but with Havertz going back into that midfield role or into another area of the pitch. Because if we know anything, we know how much Arteta loves Havertz. And I find it hard to see a scenario where someone comes in and immediately displaces him and Havertz is consigned to a backup.
I wouldn't mind asking you, James, and it's the multi-million-dollar question. Like, who does fit best and is most realistic? Because I've seen the same debate that we're having all over social media and podcasts and forums and blogs and television programs. There is certainly going to be reservation internally, I'm sure, about Gyokeres and every other candidate for whatever particular reason. Isak doesn't come without reservation. For sure. People have said, what about Ekitike? And I don't know of him being one sort of high up on Arsenal's radar so far. I don't know if that changes, and his name's being touted everywhere, which suggests there's some pretty heavy lifting going on from an agent or maybe Eintracht Frankfurt. We've talked many times, Ayo, about there being an imbalance between supply and demand of these number 9s. I think there's an underrated striker who Arsenal watched last night score against them in Muniz, Brazilian, 23
not
years
after
old.
that open goal, David. Not after that open
He
goal.
missed that, but
no.
he's no. I'm not saying for Arsenal, but I just mean in that market, you're looking very closely at who might be the solution, and for all of the sort of dissatisfaction that people articulate about somebody, tell me who meets the criteria of being the right player for you and also at the right price point and availability and ticks as many of the boxes as possible.
Get the crystal ball out. Come on.
Well, as you say, David, all these deals come with some element of risk. With Isak, you've mentioned the injury record. I think the prohibitive price and what that could do to your other business. Sesko, is he going to develop into the player that many believe he will? You can never be quite sure. Gyokeres, can he translate the form? There's always this question mark. And the reality is that at some point this summer, presumably, Arsenal are going to have to take the plunge. They're not going to be able to keep saying, we're not quite sure the right option's out there. They need that centre forward, especially with the injuries sustained by Havertz and Gabriel Jesus, which is going to keep him out really for some time into next season as well. So they're going to have to take the plunge. And if we take those three as an example, Arsenal have an interest in all those players, but you could make the case that they're kind of driven by different aspects of the club. We know about Mikel Arteta's admiration for Isak, that would be his guy. We know that Berta is a long-standing fan of Gyokeres. That would perhaps be his guy. The pre-existing club setup that Edu built, the recruitment department have been following Sesko and working on that player potentially as a long-term target. So you've got this situation where there's a kind of love triangle, I guess, around Arsenal's centre-forward position.
Okay, quickly, David. You mentioned Zubimendi earlier. What's the current status on that potential move? Because I was looking at a recent Q&A that you did on The Athletic, and you debunked the rumours of interest from Real Madrid for now anyway. Where are Arsenal with that?
Famous last words. I can't wait for that one to come back and haunt me. We can only go on the information that we source from our journalistic work, and so far I haven't corroborated the suggestions coming out of Spain that Real Madrid are prioritising Martin Zubimendi. But all of the interrogation we've done suggests that Arsenal are expecting him to arrive in the summer, and that they put a huge amount in over a number of months last summer, because they've been across Zubimendi for a few years now. And then Liverpool came to the fore last summer. It didn't happen. And I think Arsenal kind of redoubled their efforts to land him in the summer of 2025. They've been really sort of careful and diligent and attentive to his desire. He's been very settled and happy. They've not managed to lure him away from San Sebastian. I mean, you can understand him on that front. Internally, they seem to be working on the basis that Zubimendi will be coming in and being part of the squad, and they'll be building the midfield and the team with him in there, and the sort of relationship and partnership he has with Merino pre-existing from La Real, and so we don't know that it's done and signed, sealed, delivered. Maybe it is and we're not aware. Maybe it isn't, and they still have to go through those final steps. But I think Edu a little bit when he was in position, certainly Jason Ato in his interim role, have gone to great lengths around that situation.
Yeah, top stuff. Right, James, very quickly, we spoke about it a little bit at the top, but, we're looking at potential outgoings this summer. I think Jorginho's contract is up, Thomas Partey's contract is up, but also you look ahead, Bukayo Saka, William Saliba, Gabriel, Martinelli as well. Those contracts also need to be tied up. We always think about incomings, but you also have to think about the long-term future of the club. I know William Saliba has publicly stated that he's happy at Arsenal, but, things can change in the next 2 years.
Yeah, and there are arguably a few more names that should be on that list. Leandro Trossard's got a contract situation coming up, and Arsenal need to make a decision on his future. And of course, Ethan Ranieri and Miles Lewis-Skelly. FA rules state that under 18-year-olds can only sign a maximum of a 3-year contract, so they're relatively short-term deals. Those players have obviously broken through since then to the first team, and Arsenal will be keen to tie them down in the longer term. So a lot of work to be done. I think Arsenal have started to make headway on some of those deals, particularly with the younger players, the likes of Ranieri. But Saka, Saliba, Gabriel, big names, big pillars of the team, really. If I think about the sort of Saliba and Saka situations, they signed not too long ago, right? They signed 4-year contracts, and now here we are 2 years later, renegotiating again. Arsenal knew that would happen. They knew that would happen, and their philosophy at the time was, well, look, if those players perform well, we'll be happy to sit down and renegotiate with them. Whether they're still saying that now, I don't know. And they dragged out a little bit, those negotiations. It got towards the final 12 months of those players' contracts, and Arsenal were in vulnerable positions. They will be looking, Arsenal, at Liverpool right now, potentially losing Trent Alexander-Arnold, it seems. There's some jeopardy still over Virgil van Dijk and Mohamed Salah, and Arsenal will be desperate to avoid a situation like that. So that will be as big a part of Andrea Berta's job as anything else.
Okay, well, Arsenal have Everton next in the Premier League, and of course that big one against Real Madrid on the 8th of April. Gents, thank you so much for your time, David, James, and also thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and also leave us a cheeky comment as well. Right, good to see you. Until the next time. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.